Season 1 of Notebook on Cities and Culture is brought to you by Carl Haley, Daniel Murphy, and Douglas Dollars, who reminds you to be present, be loving, and that life moves really fast. So how far back do you have to go in your life to find the earliest point where you considered Los Angeles to be not just a place to come from or a place to live, but a subject to be interested in? I mean, when did that begin, do you think, for you?
I think it started for me when I was probably about 9-10 years old. My father was a big sports fan, and he used to take my brother and I to games at the Coliseum. And then when I was about 10, he decided part of our rites of manhood would be that we would sell programs for football games at the Coliseum. And that also entailed going by ourselves via the streetcar. This is while they still existed, down to the Coliseum. And I started seeing the whole city, the historic city. And I was always fascinated by it, especially by downtown. And he also thought it would be a good thing to drive from Alameda up Fifth Street to go right through Skid Row. And he used to say to us, "This is what happens if you don't do your homework."
It's Notebook on Cities and Culture. I'm Colin Marshall, sitting here deep in the Los Angeles Public Library, speaking with Glen Creason, the Map Librarian here at the Los Angeles Public Library, author of Los Angeles in Maps, a book that for me is quite addictive, combining as it does Los Angeles, maps, and often this almost whimsical display of quantitative information in a qualitative way. Now, you mentioned the old streetcar system, and there's two maps, at least that include that focus on that system, and that included many more. Tell me a little bit about that system, because it's something people won't know about if they're fresh transplants to Los Angeles. Even if they were born here, they'll often be surprised there was a streetcar system. How does that fit into your personal history with the city, besides what you've just mentioned, writing that out there to the Coliseum?
Well, I think it's one of a very well-kept secret here, because a lot of Los Angelinos, people that have grown up here, don't realize that at one time, it's not just the opinion of local people, but it had the reputation of being the finest mass transit system in the whole world, not just in the United States.
In fact, in Who Framed Roger Rabbit, they have a character say that, don't they? They made the movie in the mid-'80s, so it was designed to get a laugh. But
that's right, but it's
real.
It's true, and part of it was, a lot of things in Los Angeles happened because there was money to be made, and there were a lot of different small trolley companies, and then once Huntington got a hold of the idea, and they saw that there was going to be big money in it by buying real estate in the areas where the tracks went, the rail system just spread out all over the whole county, all far away as San Bernardino, all the way up to the top of Mount Wilson, and it was so convenient, and they kept the prices low. You could go for a nickel, you could go down to Venice, or you could go up to the top of Mount Wilson, and it was just an easy way to get around, and it really helped the city. Places in the outlying areas like Monrovia or Azusa or something like that, you could go out there now, whether otherwise it was just quite a trek to do that.
That streetcar system is one of the engines of the city's growth you can trace with the historical maps you've assembled in Los Angeles in Maps. But there's other things as well. There's the water, the movies, the oil. I mean, when you look at maps specifically, what has always jumped out at you as the engines of the city, just from looking at the way the city has been laid out on paper?
I think what you said is exactly true. That the main things are water, which was always so important in the city growing. Not only the finding of water, the delivery of water, the control, storm drains and so forth, and sewage. These were all big, important problems that had to be solved in the city. the rails, the streetcars helped to connect the city, not only to connect the entire area, but to allow common people to explore all over Los Angeles County. And then that sort of morphed into the automotive age. And there are reasons why Los Angeles became such an automotive city. But this has always been an area that's very spread out, but still connected by all this minute network of roads and later freeways.
Now, I want to get back to the personal a little bit, to your earliest explorations of the city. What neighborhood did you grow up in?
I grew up in southeast Los Angeles County in Southgate, which is kind of a blue-collar suburb. I mean, it was almost like Leave It to Beaver territory. A lot of people worked in the factories. There were 4 factories. Those are back in the days when factory workers bought homes, had automobiles, sent their kids to private school. You were very close to Los Angeles, downtown Los Angeles, and places like Wilshire Boulevard and even Hollywood. I mean, I think Southgate is only like 10 miles away from those places. Although we lived right on the border. The border was Watts, right next to us, and that was kept completely separate. That was a different side of the city right there.
And you'll say right next to Watts to someone today, and they'll say, "Oh, right next to Watts, that isn't that a bad neighborhood? Leave It to Beaver. How could that be? What would you say to somebody who makes that assumption?"
Well, there were. A lot of the people that lived in Southgate had originally lived in Watts when it was actually a farming community. There was lots of farms there, dairy farms, and there was a lot of open ground there. Now, it later became an African American neighborhood, and then later after that, it became a Latino neighborhood. So it's kind of a mixed neighborhood. I think because of the Watts riots in 1965. People had this view of Watts as this foreboding, dangerous. There were certainly dangerous areas of it where there was gangs and so forth, but in its way, it wasn't that much different than a community like Southgate, except people were a different color.
Now, this phrase "open ground," looking at the maps in Los Angeles and maps, especially the ones from the late 19th century or the early 20th century, meant to attract people to Los Angeles. They seem to do it with just that open space. Look at this vast emptiness you could come to. Mm-hmm. And they make it look, it's pitched with this, like, how appealing is this, endless open space with no people around. It seems like an odd proposition to me to want to just come to this emptiness. Tell me why that was appealing to people settling in Los Angeles back then.
Well, I think there's several maps in the book that really emphasize that, and one of them literally, it's a traveler map, and it literally shows Los Angeles as this Edenic, the city as garden, as a place of unlimited opportunity, open spaces, and beautiful, clear air, and one of them advertises Hollywood, and sort of claims that you can see the Pacific Ocean from there. So the whole idea of Los Angeles as sort of an Eden, where you can live free and create your own destiny, that's sort of the thing that they sold. And there were, as early as the 20s, they had concerted efforts to sell that idea to get more people out here.
And one of the most fascinating elements of these maps, these boosterist maps trying to get people out, is that this was before, of course, maps on the internet easily findable. They could, in some sense, lie with maps. They could bend the geography a little bit, bend the patterns of human habitation a bit to make things seem, I don't know if more appealing is the word, but how did they make things seem with the sleight of hand map makers used?
They definitely used quite a bit of a liberal interpretation of geography. And they would focus on areas that were developed. Mm-hmm. So one of the things that they did in the early panoramic maps is they would show civic buildings, and then land, nice picturesque scenes, places, like Elysian Park, and then land where it appeared that you could grab a piece of it and start your own rancho. And they just sort of ignore the parts of the city that are nuts and bolts. Although in the early panoramic maps, one of the things they used to like to show were smokestacks with smoke belching out of the smokestacks to show that, oh, yes, we have industry, we have factories here, plenty of jobs. And you also notice later on when they're more tourist oriented, everybody is water skiing or riding horses, it's playing tennis or golf. It's like nobody ever worked here. They just played the year round.
The idea of Los Angeles as a kind of Eden pitched by these map makers, there's that, but there's also something I've heard from people who grew up in Los Angeles between, whether it's the 30s, the 40s, the 50s, maybe the early 60s. They'll talk about it as being an Edenic kind of place back then, and that they were somehow kicked out of paradise somewhere in the 70s or 80s. People who've lived here for a long time, maybe it's rose-colored glasses, maybe it's not. What do you think? Do you see an Eden out of which you were kicked in Los Angeles at some point?
I definitely see, my friends and I who grew up in Southgate, we think that we were pretty lucky. I mean, it seems pretty ordinary. But to us, it was almost like, Huck Finn, because I lived near 100 Acre Park and the kids kind of just roamed around there without too much adult supervision, which was fine with us. But once the city, like downtown, you could make a case that downtown was completely dead. And decaying in the early 70s. And then
what was it like? I mean, what was the actual experience of this dead downtown like? I hear about the deadness of downtown. I see it in some movies, but how did it feel?
Well, basically at 6 o'clock, there was no city. It was just like empty streets. Skid Row was a very dangerous place. And Skid Row, of course, was, there were less shelters and more people on the street, although there's a tremendous amount of people on the streets now. And there were lots more in the late put on the streets, like in the mid 70s and the early 80s. But people just didn't come downtown to do anything. There wasn't any LA Live, there wasn't any Staples Center. I mean, the closest you could say to people wanting to come downtown, you might go to Alvaro Street, but you would leave. You wouldn't be there in the evenings. And as far as, around City Hall and everything, everybody was gone by 6 o'clock.
And they go back to wherever they happen to come from, whatever suburb they go.
Yeah. They go back to places like Southgate or the Valley or Pasadena or something.
Right, their personal Leave It to Beaver type areas they return to.
Even when I started at the library in the late 70s, tourists came and they said, "Where should we go?" We would send them to Pasadena or Beverly Hills or something like that, maybe even Westwood. So
just don't stick around this neighborhood.
Yeah, and don't walk, towards Alameda. Don't walk that direction. So, but it's different now. I mean, there's bars and there's things to do and places to go, and you can sometimes be down here like the Disney Concert Hall and places like that, where it's really lively and a lot of vitality.
Now, after the Southgate childhood, where was your next move in Los Angeles?
I went to college at UCLA, so I kind of gravitated towards the west side, and I lived out there for about 8 years, I think. And I got married, and then we moved to Los Feliz. So then that was another whole experience. I didn't know anything about it, that part of town, but West LA, to me, especially in the 70s, that was kind of like a happening place.
Now, to be at UCLA, then, the obvious gag and response is that nobody who was actually there would ever remember it. But what was that like?
Well, it was I started in the Summer of Love, the actual Summer of Love. That was my first year there, and I think that I had more fun than I learned things. Although I was an English major, so I did read a lot of classic things, and some of it stuck. But it was it was the time of the hippies and, people smoking pot on the steps of Powell Library. And there was like a riot when I was a senior, and the police came in and they beat people with clubs and all that. And so, but there was a lot of student involvement, and there was a lot of vitality on that campus, like for social change. But it also was the great years of the John Wooden basketball team. So that was a lot of fun.
Today, it seems like the main divide in Los Angeles, the main dividing line, at least to my perception, is the West Side and the rest. Some maps emphasize this in your book, some don't. In that time when you were at UCLA, was it that way as well? Like, you were on the West Side, you were probably going to be on the West Side most of your days during that stretch, or how did you perceive the halves of the city, or was it more than halves? Was it more divided? Was it less divided? What was your mental image of Los Angeles then?
I think in those days, my image was there were like several cities. Downtown was Nowheresville. Venice was a very hip place, but there was a lot of like junkies and things there. So there was a lot of crime. Santa Monica always was a fantastic place, and Pasadena. Those are sort of Long Beach had its own scene, but Pasadena and Santa Monica were always places that had some kind of interesting street life, places to go and things to do. But then again, there was also the Valley, which had a completely separate scene and that sort of bled into West LA also. And West LA would include, Culver City, Mar Vista, Venice, those communities down there.
Now, it sounds like, I'll hear certain historians of Los Angeles talk about the 70s, the early 80s as a particularly bad time for Los Angeles. But it sounds like on the shall we say, the edges of the perimeter, it was a pretty good time.
I think it was. And I think it was, people just kind of took a deep breath, and then the city kind of reinvented itself. Because in the 80s, even in the late 70s, they started doing a lot of building in downtown. I don't think just because you put up a skyscraper, makes it good, but it did make downtown a place worth visiting. And because of the businesses that came down here, then people started rediscovering places like Angel's Flight and the Bradbury Building and the Plaza and different things like that, and even the old cathedrals and stuff like that. So people started seeing even the old Los Angeles a little more as the new Los Angeles was taking place.
Now, in Los Angeles and maps in your book, there's a wealth of maps from the 19th century through the 1960s. There seems to be less to work with in the 70s, 80s, and 90s. Is that the case in the actual map archives? Is there less of interest to you from that era, map-wise?
I'm afraid that's true. In my case, it might be different for other people, but I searched a lot of archives, and we collected here for over 100 years. But sort of the real golden age of maps, the really interesting visually interesting maps was in the 30s and 40s, and sometimes in the 50s. It became more difficult to find interesting things in, say, 70s or 80s, and I wanted to include materials from those decades. But we found a nice one for East Los Angeles that was done in the 70s. And there was a couple of things that I found from the 80s that were nice, but I just had trouble getting permissions for them. So, maybe if there's a volume 2, we'll find some materials there. And I also was disappointed in what I really wanted to represent the Valley a little more, and that was harder also.
Now, what about Los Angeles? Just to get this in the clearest possible terms, what about Los Angeles is so well revealed on maps? So, what about the city makes it a fascinating place to see as a two-dimensional graphical representation. If it's about its history or about its layout, something about the city makes it interesting map-wise. I don't quite know the word I'm looking for, but do you see what I mean?
Yes. I think there's three things that I find fascinating about the city, and that is it's actually a very dramatic setting, geographic setting, because you have the San Gabriel Mountains, which I don't think there's another city in the country where you have such an abrupt, I'm trying to think of the right words, but a dramatic rise of the landscape as those San Gabriel Mountains. Right. And then Los Angeles is a city of hills. I mean, some of them have been planed down and completely removed. There's in early Los Angeles history, there's hills that are mentioned that no longer exist. Bunker Hill, Pound Cake Hill, and those kind of things. But the fact that Los Angeles has this dramatic setting, the Pacific Ocean on one side, these beautiful dramatic mountains on the other side, and less than 100 miles away, the Mojave Desert. So it's such an unusual and dramatic setting, and the fact that there seem to be sort of natural roads. I mean, the young Indians had certain trade routes and roads that they took. They continue to be used. I mean, some of them are freeways. So that's interesting to me.
The drama goes beyond the geography, though, doesn't it? I mean, there's the drama of the spirit it takes to build all those freeways. It takes to divert a river, takes to get water here. It's at every stage in the maps you see this almost stereotypical American frontier spirit, don't you? Of man, maybe not even man versus nature, but how do you think about it?
I think not only that, but another amazing part of Los Angeles, I think, is that even though it's kind of a cliched word, is that it was such a multicultural city right from the very beginning. The original settlers were mostly Black, Indian, Hispanic people from what later became Mexico. But as the city developed, there were almost every nationality you can imagine. There were Russians, there were Italians, French, Chinese. There was a big Japanese population. So, and the Native Americans, there was a sizable amount of them here, and they played a large part in the development of Los Angeles. And a lot of the stuff that we take for granted, I shouldn't leave out the Irish either, because that's part of my, but these people developed, and in Los Angeles, you might think of it as, money, but a lot of this is sweat of people just working really hard and building these things that we sort of take for granted. I mean, I just, for an example, I was just reading a thing about the 3rd Street Tunnel, which is an amazing story about what they had to do to build that.
And for those who are listening, who don't know what was required to build that tunnel, what can you tell us that really highlights what it took to build that?
Well, to hew a tunnel that would take like 4 lanes of traffic, 1,300 feet through solid rock, and then there was a cave-in in which 13 men were buried in there. They died. Not all of them died, but some of them died. But just to give you an example of this, that tunnel alone, the 3rd Street Tunnel, when they finished it, I read accounts that said that 5,000 people an hour passed through there. Now, this is in a city where there's only 60,000 people.
Right at the time.
So, I mean, that was quite a thoroughfare. And that's not even taking the wagons and horses and stuff that we're going through. And
you touch on this a little in the book, but the projects that the tunnels and the freeways taken on to make Los Angeles what it is, there's all the effort you can see you can see going into them in these maps. And then today you think of the freeways and you think of people just sweating bullets there, angry, on the verge of road rage.
Mm-hmm.
What is that? I don't even know what question to ask about it, but it's what does it mean that the miracles of civic engineering have at this moment in history resulted in people just getting angry that they have to use them?
Well, I mean, look at Carmageddon that we had not too long ago. You know, people just absolutely thought it was the end of the world. And I'm the first person, you know, yesterday I was stuck in traffic. I went out to visit my brother on the 5 freeway, and it, you know, hour and a half took me like 30 minutes just to clear the Civic Center. So
I should explain to listeners not from Los Angeles, Carmageddon was the brief closure of the 405 for some kind of, what was the project they were closing for?
They were retrofitting a bridge.
Right. And the weekend didn't live up to its name, as I understand, in terms of disaster.
Not at all. It was actually like a vacation.
But it's a disaster-minded place, isn't it, Los Angeles? I mean, maybe for people outside of it, they think of, oh, well, it's, you know, an earthquake's going to shake that place away, and better if it does it soon, you know. But here, there seems to be more of an acceptance, or what do you call the sentiment about the possibilities of things going wrong, and almost the sort of like, yeah, bring it on, I guess, you know, it's going to happen.
Well, this is a city where, you know, an earthquake can happen at any time. And, you know, we've had at least 3 real big ones in my lifetime. I mean, there have been several more that were smaller, but I mean, this is a city where you have mudslides. Right. You can, people don't remember this because they made flood channels in the 30s, but this used to be a city that was absolutely tormented by floods, and there was lots of destruction and death caused by the LA River flooding. Right.
And that's a fascinating thing to me. I'm sorry to interrupt, but one of the first questions that someone new to Los Angeles will ask, and I had been a visitor for a long time myself early on, I said, you know, what's the deal with how there's not a lot of water in that river? I mean, it sounds like such a simple question to somebody who has lived here all their lives, but your book does answer it. It sounds like that was a source of disasters until it became the odd low channel we see today.
Yeah, it is. And, you know, people tend to complain about it, but it was necessary in a way. But now there are groups that are reclaiming parts of the LA River, and they're making it actually really beautiful in places. And one of the people that wrote an essay in my book, Joe Linton, he's active in that. Well, they're trying to open the city up to everything. You know, they do that cyclovia, which is a great idea, and then
I've cycled in that. It's fun.
Yes, they do tours of the river and so forth. But you know, by the turn of the century, the river was the water was being all used. So, and the city wasn't going to get any bigger, and that's how we managed to get the water from the Owens Valley, which is another controversial subject. But still, to this day, I'm told that 17% of all the water that we get out of the tap in Los Angeles still comes from the LA River.
Oh, it's not so bad for the way that it's looked in recent decades. It's giving more water than I would have thought.
Yes.
Now, the LA River is one of the landmarks that in all the maps in Los Angeles and maps I would use to orient myself, because it's pretty much always in the maps. You know, that's the LA River. That's Westlake, or MacArthur Park today. And often I would find where I live. I would find I live next to the site of the old Ambassador, so I would find that there in Koreatown, formerly the Ambassador District. I imagine for you these maps were always an opportunity to trace your own personal history around Los Angeles. I mean, was that a way for you to process these maps yourself, to see, you know, my path through Los Angeles? What did it look like in all of these eras?
That's certainly true, but you know, my dirty secret is that I have no sense of direction. So if I go to a mall, I have no idea where my car is. But you know, all my life I basically just knew the mountains were north, and the ocean, you know, was west, and East LA was over there, and but yeah, I definitely do. The landmarks that I look at mostly are always Elysian Park, say like San Pedro, Point Fermin down there, Venice, that from one end of the city to the other, and then of course that big huge expanse at the top, the valley, which, as I told you earlier, I'm always lost when I'm up there because I don't know the landmarks there.
Now, you mentioned from UCLA you went on to a neighborhood that I haven't trained myself to the correct pronunciation. It's Los Feliz, but Los Files in the local pronunciation. How does the city look from that vantage point, from when you were based there?
Well, that area has a very interesting history, which I shouldn't go into, but it was a rancho, and then there's a very colorful history of J. Griffith, who basically gave the city lots of things, but Griffith Park being one of the main things. That was at one time sort of the top of the city. That was like the extent. It was considered kind of Latuli's. But then when there's one of the maps in the books is of Laughlin Park, which is a development that they literally, where we were talking about the Los Angeles as Eden, where they set out to create an Eden within the city. And that is Laughlin Park is one of the most beautiful areas in the city, and it was laid out by the same guy that laid out UCLA.
This idea of the creation of an Eden sounds like it sounds so in the spirit of a lot of these maps that I see in your book, and it sounds like something a foreign observer, a non-American observer, would consider distinctively American, the idea that you can create an Eden. And, I think of the way that foreign writers from outside the United States write and think about Los Angeles, and it seems to them, and even foreign friends who visit of mine, seems to them to be a very confusing city. Is that the impression you get from what you've read or who you've talked to, people who are not only not Californian, not even American, approaching Los Angeles? I mean, is it difficult to penetrate for them?
I run into them every day at the library. I run into a lot of people, and they're not used to the distances that you have to travel, and they will tend to sort of, I don't know, if I had a nickel for every time I heard these sayings like, you can't get a good piece of pizza in Los Angeles, or there's not a good bar in the city. Yeah. or actually I just saw this little, it's quickly becoming a cliche, this thing about things people say, and there's one of LA, and the girls are talking to each other, and they name these places they have no idea what they are, like Toluca Lake and Downey, which is where I went to high school.
No,
it's so spread out, and it's so but this sort of electronic age really helps a lot, because with the whole Yelp universe, people now might know to go to Monterey Park to get really great Chinese food, or go to Boyle Heights to a really great Mexican restaurant.
It is fascinating. You mentioned the multicultural nature of the city, and I guess I'll start off throwing this out here. I was flying to Mexico City from LAX recently, and there was a big poster going the other way when you're going into the city, which is the big photo of Villaraigosa's face, and it says, "Welcome to Los Angeles, the city that's a world in itself." And at first that sounds like your standard, boilerplate boosterism, but then I realized, well, it is that, and that's kind of why I came here. I mean, what do you think about a statement like that, a city that is itself a world?
Well, I hate to agree with him, but I do agree with that. And, because Los Angeles has all these neighborhoods. I think Chicago is famous for being a city of neighborhoods, but Los Angeles really has that too. We have Thai Town, and we have Little Armenia, and we have Little India that's out there by Norwalk, and all these ethnic communities, which once you actually experience it, it's a great thing. You can go to a parade in Chinatown and celebrate the Year of the Dragon, and you can go to Pioneer Boulevard on a Saturday, and you can see it looks like Bombay or Calcutta or something. So It is. It is a really, really fascinating city, but unfortunately, you can't just, leave your brownstone and walk 3 blocks. Here, you got to get in a car and probably drive for half an hour.
It is a fascinating quality of this is because you mentioned Chinatown, of course, which is fairly close to where we are. Little Tokyo, also downtown, or any of these communities, they exist downtown, but then you go to the other versions of them. You go to the San Gabriel Valley and you get even more Chinese stuff, and you go to Torrance and Gardena and you get even more Japanese stuff. You get these communities in microcosm downtown or near it, and then you go to sort of the edges and they amplify. I mean, how do you describe what that is?
It's this city is always had that element, and it's always some of them have actually changed, because once upon a time Lincoln Heights they had a very strong Italian community there. I don't know how much of it is left, but and even when I was like a teenager, I used to be a delivery boy. And there was a German community in downtown, and around like 18th, around near Venice. And there was a restaurant there called Turner's, and people would actually, be in there singing German songs and drinking big flagons of German beer and stuff. And I would expect that in 20 or 30 years there'll be some communities of who knows what, maybe Uzbekistanis or something. I don't know, but I think the city sort of lends itself to that, and the rest of the city doesn't leave them as just an enclave. They sort of participate. Right.
Now, you mentioned the inability here to step out of your brownstone and walk to where you need to go necessarily, but what's fascinating is, you've lived in the area your whole life, and I only came here over the summer, but I've personally found it to be surprisingly walkable. I don't have a car here, and it shocks friends when I tell them how often I ride, the subway or other train lines here. Do you get the sense that the days might be coming back to where you can get around more easily in Los Angeles, where things are more walkable or get aroundable in some way that isn't based on a car? Is there, I don't know if I should frame it as a change back to the way it was, but is there something going on in that respect? Because I feel like I found it to be much easier to navigate than anybody had ever told me before I came here.
Well, I think absolutely, and I think it's a good thing, because, for example, my daughter, who's in her 20s, she knows public transportation really well, whereas I'm completely lost if I don't have my car. Right. But she knows how to get around on the subway. She knows how to get around on the bus and, Dash and things like that. We just have to be going in that direction. And not only that, but to open up the city to bicycles, just like people are doing. That's such an eye opener to participate in that. We did that the last time they did it, and it was so much fun, and it was such a great community spirit. Everybody was very friendly, and there was no, even though there was actual drinking, and but it was all real good natured. So right. I really am. I would like to be more adept at using public transportation. And in downtown, we do have neighborhoods now where sort of that loft neighborhood where Worst Cooch is, and down there, those are neighborhoods that are very much like New York, where you don't need a car, where you can walk around.
Yeah, I enjoy all those neighborhoods myself and go to them very often. But there's Christopher Isherwood's novel, A Single Man. It gives a perspective I've always enjoyed on early 60s Los Angeles from this transplanted Englishman's point of view. And the character that he creates, the college professor, marvels at how he gets from his Santa Monica home to what is now Cal State Los Angeles in 20 minutes on the freeway, and how fantastic that is. This is the city of the future, in a sense. And is there a sense in which, you mentioned how you're more familiar with driving than public transit. Is there a sense in which you ever think, well, those days when it was literally 20 minutes to everywhere, if it was true, that was pretty good. What happened to those?
That's exactly what I thought yesterday.
Oh, yes.
Yeah, where I wished that I was on a subway that was, or a bullet train or something like that.
But the days of driving, I mean, is it really true? There wasn't a time when you get in your car and you're really 20 minutes from wherever, smooth sailing, that maybe the old...
As long as you didn't go downtown, I think that might have been true. But downtown had worse traffic in the 30s than it has now.
Oh,
so,
really?
Yeah, they had awful traffic. I can remember even as a kid, before there were some freeways, that we would go to Park La Brea from Southgate, and it was all done on surface streets. And just as if you timed it, you could go, right down. You can actually go down Wilshire Boulevard that way. If you kept at a certain speed, they had the traffic lights set up.
You could go at exactly the right speed, hit all the greens, and you'd be there?
Yeah, that was the idea.
Now, some of the maps in Los Angeles and maps, some of the most fascinating ones, were printed up by automobile clubs, and they're all about driving, all about how to get around Los Angeles in your car. And it's this concept that fascinates me of the city as a driver's paradise. And I just want to get the sense of how much of a driver's paradise it was, or was that a form of sleight of hand, of bending the truth? What's the reality here?
I think there's quite a bit of bending the truth, but it might have been a driver's paradise from like 10 to 3.
Ah, okay.
Yeah, 8 to 8, 7 to 9, and 4 to 6, not so much. But yeah, and certain areas of town always were. Even where I live now, I live in Glacel Park. We don't really have any traffic problem. The 10 freeway goes both ways, Now
tell me about the road, I guess metaphorically, that you took to become the map librarian. I mean, how did that happen for you?
Well, it was just kind of serendipity, because I was a reference librarian and I had to use maps to answer questions. We all do in the history department, and there was a fire in 1986, and then we had to move the maps, and we moved them to Spring Street. We had temporary facility there, and then we moved them back here. By the time we got to Spring Street, the map librarian, she'd had it. So they put the job up, and the library had sort of been disconnected in 1986, so there wasn't a lot of interest in working at Central at that point. And so I applied for the job. I didn't know anything about the maps except as I used them as tools, and I got the job. And then I was like, oh shit! Now I'm gonna have to. So I literally just pulled them out of the drawers and looked at them and studied them and called people. I went all over the city. I went to UCLA, talked to Carlos Hagen. He was the map librarian there, and a guy named Michael Swift at Cal State Northridge, and people at the archives and at the vault at City Hall and everything. And everybody's helped me and taught me until I, didn't embarrass myself anymore. But I think the very first staff meeting we had that I was map librarian, somebody asked me what scale was, and I didn't even know what that was.
I'll get back to you on that.
Yeah.
Tell me, when did the inklings come, when you were past the point of getting the basic knowledge you needed for the job? When was the point that you realized these historical maps you came into so much contact with could reveal so much about Los Angeles?
It really comes down to every time I would get them out, and we'd put them on a counter, people would gather around them, the people who were just drawn to them like magnets. And I started seeing that people love maps, and and you learn from them and you read them just like you would a novel. And in some cases, you spend more time studying them. Actually, the guy who's the Jeopardy whiz, Ken Jennings, he wrote a book called Maphead, all kinds of interesting insights into maps and the love of maps in that book. But once I started seeing how people gravitated to these things and wanted to see them, then I realized their place shouldn't be in a drawer. So I tried to we got an exhibit in 94. I think we had an exhibit that was very popular, and then thanks to a lady named Gloria Gerace. I got to have a big exhibit about 3 years ago, LA Unfolded, and boy, it really 30,000 people visited that exhibit. So that shows you that people are fascinated by maps and do see the way that they illustrate Los Angeles history. So
you're tapping into a desire for a knowledge here. I mean, what sense do you get about what Angelenos really want to know about the city they live in? It seems to me that if so many people are fascinated, that means there's something that they haven't known, that they want or need to know, and they only realize when they look at a map.
Well, I think they want to know where we came from, how we started, why we did what we did. Why did we let these? Why, if we had this fantastic rapid transit system, why did we let that die out? Why would we choose to be sitting on freeways cursing at each other when we could be, like reading a book and rolling along on the subway?
Right.
So they want to know that. They want to know. There's a lot of interest in like Mexican Los Angeles or Spanish colonial Los Angeles. There's interest in that. There's interest in how the city changed and what happened before, what it looked like before the freeways, and what the freeways, how it changed the city. So many things that probably, a dozen more aspects that people, that's why they look at these maps. And then there's just the plain good old reminiscing. People will look and say, oh, I remember, oh, look, there's Ponyland. When I was a kid, my dad took me there. So they like that too.
When you're putting in so much time with these maps, even for someone like you who spent your life in Los Angeles, what kinds of things are revealed about the city that surprise even you? I mean, you don't have to, I'm not putting you on the spot for specific facts, but the types of things, what types of histories or stories or facts come out of these maps that make you think, how could I not have known that?
Gee, there's so many of them. I mean, there's some that are just weird. Like in looking at maps at the turn of the century, I was amazed by how many people raised rabbits. Yeah. Rabbits were a big deal in LA. It's like, why? What's that? And then there was like these gambling ships off the coast where people would take a little shuttle out and they would gamble because they'd be 7 miles off the shore.
Yes.
That's one thing. The whole story of Central Avenue, where the African American, they were, because of covenants, they were kind of stuck with this one area, right. And instead of just giving up, they made it something really special.
I wanted to go there when you mentioned it in the book. I wanted to go back then to Central, because it's, if it's good enough for Orson Welles to visit, it's good enough for me, right?
Well, and plus the people that were there, Louis Armstrong and Duke Ellington, Billie Holiday. So it was just a really, and of course the white people wanted to get in on this excitement, so they would go down there too. So
we mentioned off mic before recording that recently there was, of course, the Ken Burns Prohibition series, which led to people wanting to know more about Los Angeles during that time. What are the currents of intellectual curiosity you've seen roll by, I guess waves is a better description than currents, of what people have wanted to know about Los Angeles in recent years, decades, since you've been here? What keeps coming back as an interest that sort of is hard to finally satiate? The new people keep coming back all the time with questions.
I think the main things are they're endlessly fascinated with Chavez Ravine. What happened in Chavez Ravine? They are fascinated with like the Zoot Suit riots. What happened then?
Some listeners won't know what did happen in Chavez Ravine.
Well, Chavez Ravine was an area where there were 3 different communities just on hills, and again, the word Edenic. It was like people lived in. Some of them were, very humble, but it was a very close-knit community, mostly different ethnicities all living together. And Mexicans, African Americans, Filipinos, whites, all kinds of mixture. The city eventually decided that they would buy, just basically use eminent domain and push these people out because they were going to build public housing there, which they thought, I think that a lot of it had good intentions, but they removed the people, and some of them reluctantly, and to the point of, having shotguns, and the marshals came and took them out. And then after all that was said and done, the Los Angeles Dodgers, the Dodgers came from Brooklyn, and they looked around the city and they thought that would be a perfect place to build a ballpark. And so they worked this deal where they traded land where the old Wrigley Field was, which is, down at, I think 42nd and Avalon. And Mr. O'Malley traded that land and $1 million and got Chavez Ravine to build Dodger Stadium. So a lot of people blame the Dodgers, but the Dodgers were sort of like the second cousin to the original displacement of those families.
This notion of there still being good intentions behind certain projects that had side effects we now consider to be bad, or things that need to be fixed now. I think of the LA River and how, there's certainly, it seemed like a good idea to put that much concrete around it. Maybe there could have been less. It certainly probably seemed like a good idea to be on freeways rather than on trains at some point. But now we reconsider it. I mean, is that a theme in Los Angeles history, in the history of the built Los Angeles? Things seemed like an excellent idea, and maybe were only a pretty good idea as time went on. Or what do you think about that?
I think there's I think there's a whole history of that in the city, and a lot of these things were fought over tooth and nail. Like the example of the sewage system. Once they developed the whole science of sewage treatment, then what are they going to do with the outfall? Where is that going to go? And where's the harbor going to be, for example? Another thing that they fought over, like tooth and nail. And, people still, have all regrets about that. And of course, the freeways, where are they going to put the freeways? And they still, like where I live, they want to do an extension of the 710 freeway, and nobody wants that because they're afraid they're going to take their property away from them. So, right. And the whole thing about the blue line, the Green Line, and all those, it's great, but somebody gets pushed aside when it happens.
Now, when you call up a modern map of Los Angeles, whether it's on Google Maps or whether you're just looking at the city, say you're up at the Griffith Observatory looking down, which I like to do to get a sense of where things are, what are the parts of the city that right now fascinate you, that your eyes are drawn toward, that you want to keep an eye on and see what's happening in at this moment?
For me, that would be the part of the city where, and you can see this in all the historic maps, where Highland Park is. Highland Park, where I live, but Cypress Park, LaSalle Park, Eagle Rock, Highland Park, Lincoln Heights, El Sereno, all these communities. To me, that's like the lungs of Los Angeles. It's a very hilly and funky neighborhood. And, even you could even sort of include Silver Lake. Right.
The northeast of downtown. All of this for those looking it up at home.
Yeah, and but it's still an area that's in flux. There's been a lot of gentrification, quote gentrification, but it's still funky, and there's you can still sort of affordable, but now there's people coming in and putting in breweries and good things. Not big giant Kmart's, or not to knock Target because I shop there sometimes, but not big box stores, but more of a street level, try to increase some kind of street level vitality. I think a street like York or Figueroa that's over there in the Highland Park area are examples of places like that it could go either way. It could get much better, or it could get worse.
Tell me what makes it the lungs of Los Angeles.
Well, just because it's still open land, there have been pitched battles with developers up there. There was a thing called Elephant Hill where they fought because a guy, he basically wanted to put 110 condos there. But the community managed to hold that off and leave it as open land. And there's Debs Park is over there, which is a nice big slice of open land still. So it's an area that's not overbuilt. There's still plenty of open ground there.
And how much of a sense do you have, based on the people you talk to here at the library, based on the maps you see, the pattern leading up to today, or even the maps of today? What do you see in terms of the way people use the city? I mean, this has been all around you since the beginning. Is that changing the way that Angelenos are approaching the place they live? Not to sound too grand, but do you ever make any observations on that order about the way you see people around you making use of what they have here?
I think it's part of my experience in Los Angeles is that because we always have an influx of people from other places, there's like I can't think of the right word, but we learn from each other. For example, I have some young friends that I work with, and they're from other parts of the country, like Pennsylvania, and they teach me things about Los Angeles because they approach it differently than I do. They know how to take a bus. They know how to go to a Dodger game and get home on public transportation, for example. So, I might be able to tell them where they can get, a great pupusa. Yes. But they know how to get around actually better than me. So
it's a form of cultural exchange, isn't it?
It is, some sense? And we've always have that here. We always have people coming and people going. We had a lot of people left Los Angeles and went to Northern California or to Oregon. But then we have this flow of people. There's always people coming here and from different parts of the country or world. So I think that's part of what keeps Los Angeles interesting, vital place.
It keeps it resilient in a certain sense, doesn't it? Despite whatever disasters may loom or what needs to be done to fix the place, that influx of new knowledge and new sensibilities seems to make you feel like things are going to be fine here, right?
Well, yeah, and it's just like the library, the whole idea of Los Angeles and the library. I can't tell you how many times I've heard us given the last rites.
Really?
Yeah, like Los Angeles is dead, it's finished, or the library is obsolete. You don't need any of this stuff anymore. And then we just keep going and keep getting better, or at least we keep progressing.
Why don't the predictions of doom stop?
I think because one of the things about LA is they're so versatile. The economy here is very versatile. There's lots of different ways that money comes in here. So when it looked like the studios were going to be dead, they made a comeback. And I mean, at one time there was huge aerospace industry here. But now there's more, there's lots of sort of software things. So
that aerospace industry is why we have a rail line going from Redondo to Norwalk, if I'm not mistaken, right?
Yeah. Yeah, well, talking about Downey, there was a huge plant there, and Long Beach had Douglas. So
I've been speaking in the Los Angeles Central Library with Glen Creason, the map librarian at the Los Angeles Public Library and the author of Los Angeles in Maps. Glen, thanks so much for taking the time today.
My pleasure.
This has been Notebook on Cities and Culture. I've been Colin Marshall. You can keep up with the cultural creators, internationalists, and observers of the urban scene on the show at colinmarshall.org. Thanks. And special thanks to the people backing this season, including Aidan Nullman, Andy Cooney, Ben Bartley, Brian J. Dell, Doubt Us Artwork, Greg Bigelow, Greg Linster, Henry Coronan, Umberto Grant, James Faber, Jonathan McKelmont, Mark Larson, Matt Warren, Mia Muratori, Nicholas Croft, Paul Doyle, Ray McGuire, Rob Montz, Robert Foley, Roberto Medri, Samuel Hansen, Sean Dudley, Small Demons, Stephen Ingles, Steve Himmer, TSD, and Wayne Wright.